The autumn of 1894 brought with it a peculiar chill to London, one that seemed to penetrate not merely the bones, but the very spirit of the city. The fog that October had been particularly dense, clinging to the cobblestones of Baker Street with an almost sentient persistence. It was on such a morning, when the gas lamps still flickered in their iron housings despite the late hour, that an event occurred which would test even the formidable faculties of Mr. Sherlock Holmes. I had risen early that day, my old wound from Afghanistan causing me the usual discomfort that presaged inclement weather. Descending the 17 steps from my bedroom to our shared sitting room, I found Holmes already awake, though whether he had slept at all remained a matter of some conjecture. He stood before the window in his mouse-colored dressing gown, his long, nervous fingers pressed together in that attitude of deep contemplation I had come to know so well. "You slept poorly, Watson," he observed without turning. "The barometric pressure has dropped significantly. Your war wound troubles you, and you have already taken laudanum's small dose. I perceive, as you are attempting to wean yourself from dependency once more." "Really, Holmes," I said, though without any real annoyance. Such demonstrations had long ceased to astound me, though I confess they never entirely lost their capacity to impress. "One day you must explain your methodology to the common man." "There is no mystery in it," he replied, finally turning to face me. His hawk-like features were drawn, his eyes possessing that feverish quality they acquired when he had gone too long without a case worthy of his attention. "You descended the stairs with your left hand gripping the banister more firmly than usual. I heard the distinctive creak of the 3rd and 7th steps, which only sound when pressure is applied from that angle. Your gait was uneven. As for the laudanum, there is a faint medicinal scent about you, and your pupils are marginally constricted despite the dim light." "Elementary, my dear fellow." I settled into my customary chair and reached for the morning papers which Mrs. Hudson had thoughtfully arranged on the side table. "Nothing of interest in the criminal line, I suppose?" Holmes made a dismissive gesture. "The usual tedium. A jewel theft in Mayfair, the work of a housemaid, beyond doubt. A forgery case that even Lestrade should manage to muddle through successfully. A missing person who has simply abandoned his creditors and taken refuge with. A woman in Brighton. London has grown remarkably dull, Watson. I find myself almost yearning for the days when Moriarty's shadow loomed over the city. At least then, the game possessed some intellectual merit." He had barely finished this statement when I found rather disturbing in its implications when we heard the distinctive tread of Mrs. Hudson ascending the stairs. There was something hurried in her approach, something that caused Holmes to straighten perceptibly. "If I am not mistaken," he murmured, "our landlady brings news that will prove either greatly alarming or intensely irritating." The irregularity of her step suggests agitation. The door opened and Mrs. Hudson appeared, her normally composed features betraying genuine distress. In her hands, held at some distance from her body, as though it might bite, was a package wrapped in brown paper and secured with common twine. "Mr. Holmes," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "this ... This was found on the doorstep not 10 minutes ago. The boy who delivers the milk nearly tripped over it. There's no marking upon it save your name, sir, written in the most peculiar hand." Holmes crossed the room in 3 swift strides, but made no move to take the package. Instead, he bent low, examining it with that extraordinary intensity that transformed his features into something raptor-like and predatory. "Most interesting," he breathed. "Watson, would you be so good as to document the exact time? Mrs. Hudson, did anyone see who left this package? Did the milk boy observe anything unusual?" "He swears he saw nothing, Mr. Holmes. He arrived at 6:30, as always, and there it was. He's a truthful lad, sir. I'd stake my reputation on it." "I do not doubt it," Holmes replied, still not touching the parcel. He produced his magnifying lens from his dressing gown pocket and subjected the package to minute examination. The paper is of common quality, available from any of 100 stationers throughout London. The twine is maritime and origin 3s, trand. Twisted hemp, the type used in shipping rather than domestic contexts, but it is the handwriting that arrests my attention. I moved closer, observing over his shoulder. The name Mr. Sherlock Holmes had been inscribed in capital letters with what appeared to be a broad-nibbed pen and black ink. Yet there was something unsettling about the script, something I could not immediately identify. "Do you see it, Watson?" Holmes asked softly. "The letters are uneven," I ventured, "as though written by someone not accustomed to writing. Not unaccustomed disguised. Observe the pressure, uniform throughout. Note the slight tremor in each vertical stroke, yet the horizontal elements are quite steady. This was written by someone holding the pen in an unnatural manner, deliberately obscuring their natural hand. Moreover, he leaned closer still. There is a faint odor. Do you detect it?" I sniffed cautiously and caught a whiff of something chemical, acrid, carbolic acid. Diluted, but yes. "Someone has taken pains to disinfect this package, Watson. Now why should that be necessary?" Mrs. Hudson had grown increasingly pale. "Mr. Holmes, should I summon the police? I'll not have dangerous articles in my house, sir, begging your pardon. The police may prove useful, but not yet." Holmes finally straightened, his eyes glittering with that peculiar light that indicated. His magnificent brain had engaged fully with a problem. "Mrs. Hudson, you have my assurance that I shall take every precaution. Watson, would you fetch my gloves and my chemistry kit? I believe we are about to receive a communication of unusual significance." As I hastened to comply, I observed that Holmes had produced a steel letter opener and was carefully examining the knot securing the twine. His movements were methodical, almost ceremonial, and I noticed that he positioned himself such that his body shielded the package from both Mrs. Hudson and myself. "Holmes," I said quietly, returning with the requested items, "do you believe this package to be dangerous?" He paused, and when he looked at me, his expression was grave. "I believe, Watson, that we are dealing with a mind of considerable cunning one, that wishes to issue a challenge. Whether the package itself presents physical danger remains to be determined. However, I am certain of one thing. Whoever left this unwanted gift upon our doorstep did so with deliberate purpose. They wish to announce themselves to initiate a game. And they have done so with a flourish designed specifically to capture my attention." He donned the gloves-heavy leather affairs used for his chemical experiments, and with infinite care began to cut the twine. Mrs. Hudson gasped and retreated toward the door. And I confess I found my hand moving unconsciously toward the drawer, where I kept my service revolver. The wrapping fell away, revealing a simple wooden box, perhaps 8 inches square and 3 inches deep. Upon its lid, burned into the wood with what must have been a hot iron, was a single symbol. An eye within a triangle. Holmes stared at this emblem for a long moment, utterly motionless. "What does it mean?" I asked. "If I am correct in my hypothesis," Holmes said slowly, "it means that we have attracted the attention of someone who believes themselves to be playing at the same level as I. Someone who fancies themselves a master of observation, deduction, and manipulation. The eye within the triangle is an ancient symbol, what's knee associated with divine providence, with the notion of an all-seeing witness. Our correspondent is claiming omniscience. Surely mere theatricality, I suggested, though I felt a cold prickle along my spine. Perhaps. But consider, they knew to leave this precisely where our landlady would find it. At precisely the hour when we would most likely be at home, yet the streets would still be empty of witnesses. They disinfected the package. Why? To eliminate any trace evidence I might use to identify them. They disguised their handwriting with considerable skill. This is no ordinary crank, Watson. this is someone who understands how I think." With agonizing slowness, Holmes lifted the lid of the box down inside. Nestled in a bed of white silk lay 3 objects: a chess piece, the White King, carved from ivory; a lock of human hair, dark and lustrous, tied with a ribbon of crimson; and a carte de visite photograph of a woman, her face scratched out with such violence that the paper had torn. And beneath these items, written on a card in that same disguised hand, was a message: "The game commences, Mr. Holmes. 3 moves to checkmate. The first sacrifice has been made. Can you see what I see? Or will you, like all the others, prove blind until the final revelation? Yours in admiration and anticipation." There was no signature. Holmes read the message twice, his lips compressed into a thin line. Then, without a word, he crossed to his desk and withdrew a fresh sheet of paper, upon which he began to sketch the contents of the box with rapid, precise strokes. "Watson," he said, his voice tight with controlled excitement, "I believe we have just received an invitation to a murder. Possibly one that has already been committed, possibly one yet to come. But make no mistakes, somewhere in London, a killer walks free, and they have chosen to make me their audience." "But Holmes, what murder? There's been nothing in the papers." "Not yet," he interrupted grimly. "Not yet. But I suspect that will change very shortly indeed. Mrs. Hudson, please send word to Inspector Lestrade at Scotland Yard. Tell him I require his presence at his earliest convenience on a matter of the utmost gravity. And Watson," he turned to face me fully, "I suggest you keep your revolver loaded and close at hand. I have a distinct feeling that whoever sent this package is watching, even now, to gauge our reaction. And if they are indeed everything they claim to be, then we have entered into a contest from which only one party will emerge victorious." I glanced toward the window, where the fog pressed against the glass like a living thing, obscuring the street beyond. Somewhere out there, in that gray miasma, a mind of diabolical cleverness had set a game in motion, a game whose rules we did not yet understand, whose stakes remained unknown. The killer had left a gift at 2-1 B Baker Street, and Sherlock Holmes, for all his legendary courage, had refused to touch it with his bare hands. Inspector Lestrade arrived within the hour, his normally ruddy complexion pale beneath his bowler hat. He stamped the moisture from his boots and accepted the brandy misses. Hudson offered with a grateful nod, though his hand trembled slightly as he raised the glass to his lips. Holmes observed this with that peculiar intensity of his, saying nothing, merely waiting with the patience of a spider at the center of its web. "Mr. Holmes," Lestrade began, setting down his glass with a sharp click against the saucer, "I was already on my way here when your message arrived. We've had a development, a nasty business in Clerkenwell. A woman's body discovered just after dawn in a rented room above a chemist's shop. The landlord found her when she failed to pay her weekly rent. At first glance, it appeared a suicide, laudanum poisoning, empty bottle beside the bed. But there were certain irregularities that troubled the surgeon, and when I examined the scene myself, I thought immediately of you." Holmes had been standing before the fireplace, but now he moved with cat-like swiftness to the table where he had arranged the contents of the mysterious package. These irregularities, Lestrade described them with precision, every detail, no matter how trivial it may seem. The inspector pulled a worn notebook from his coat pocket, consulting it with the methodical thoroughness that had made him, despite his limitations, one of the Yard's more reliable men. The woman was perhaps 30 years of age, well-dressed, though not expensively so. Dark hair, arranged carefully, even in death. But here's what struck me as peculiar. A lock of her hair had been cut away, removed with scissors or a sharp blade. Clean cut, not torn. And beside her pillow, we found a chess piece, a White King, ivory, identical to hundreds one might purchase in any toy shop. I saw Holmes's eyes flash toward the box, then back to Lestrade. Continue. On her dressing table, there was a photograph in a silver frame. The subject's face had been violently scratched out, though the frame itself bore no fingerprints whatsoever. The room had been wiped clean. Mr. Holmes. Every surface gleamed. The woman's hands showed traces of carbolic acid burns, fresh ones, acquired within hours of her death. And strangest of all, pinned to her nightdress was a card bearing a single sentence: "The first move is complete." Watson set down his teacup with a clatter, and I felt the room's atmosphere thicken perceptibly. Holmes remained motionless for a long moment, then gestured toward the box. "Inspector, examine these items. Tell me what you observe." Lestrade approached warily, his professional composure faltering as he recognized the terrible correspondence between the package's contents and his crime scene. The lock of dark hair, the defaced photograph, the ivory chess easel matched precisely what he had just described. The color drained entirely from his face. "Good Lord," he whispered. "This package, when did it arrive?" "Approximately 2 hours ago," Holmes replied, his voice unnaturally calm. "Which means our murderer delivered proof of their crime to my doorstep mere hours after its commission. They are not merely seeking attention, Lestrade. They are orchestrating a performance, and they have cast me in the role of audience. The question that concerns me is this: was the woman murdered because of me, or was I selected because of the murder? Which came first in this devil's planning?" I found my voice at last. "Holmes, surely this is evidence. We must take it to the yard immediately." "Scientific examination might reveal it will reveal nothing," Holmes interrupted sharply. "Do you not see? The carbolic acid, the meticulous cleaning, the disguised handwriting. Our adversary has eliminated every trace that might identify them. Identify forensic methodology as well as I do. Better, perhaps, for they have had leisure to plan while I must react. No, Watson, this package was not sent to provide evidence. It was sent to demonstrate superiority, to prove that they can commit murder and present the proof directly to London's foremost detective without fear of discovery." Lestrade had recovered somewhat, his professional instincts reasserting themselves. The woman's name was Helena Marbury. She claimed to be a widow, though we found no record of any marriage. Lived quietly, kept to herself. The landlord knew almost nothing about her, except that she paid promptly and received no visitors. We're pursuing inquiries among her neighbors, but so far, nothing. "You will find nothing," Holmes said with grim certainty. "She was selected precisely because she would be difficult to trace, because her death could be staged as suicide without arousing immediate suspicion. Our killer chose carefully, Lestrade. This was no crime of passion or opportunity. This was execution, coldly calculated." He turned to the window, staring out into the persistent fog. "The message speaks of 3 moves to checkmate. Miss Marbury was the first. 2 more victims are planned, perhaps already selected. We are not investigating a murder, gentlemen. We are attempting to prevent a massacre." The morning progressed with agonizing slowness as Holmes subjected every element of the mysterious package to exhaustive analysis. He examined the lock of hair beneath his microscope, tested the silk lining for chemical residues, and scrutinized the photograph's damaged surface with his lens until I feared his eyes would suffer permanent strain. Lestrade had departed for Clerkenwell to oversee the investigation there, promising to send word immediately should any new developments arise. I remained in my chair, nominally reading the Times, but in truth watching my friend's increasingly agitated movements with growing concern. "It is insufferable," Holmes muttered, abandoning his microscope to pace the length of the room like a caged panther. "Every avenue systematically closed. The hair reveals nothing beyond confirmation that it belonged to the victim, a woman of approximately 30 years, in reasonable health, who used a lavender-scented soap. The silk is common Chinese export, available from a dozen warehouses. In the East End, even the box itself yields nothing pine. Recently sanded, the burning implement likely a common soldering iron. Our murderer has been scrupulous, Watson. Maddeningly so. I set aside my newspaper, recognizing the signs of one of Holmes's darker moods descending. Perhaps Lestrade will uncover something at the victim's lodgings. A connection, a motive, some thread that might lead he. We'll find nothing because there is nothing to find, Holmes interrupted bitterly. Can you not comprehend the elegance of it? Helena Marbury was not killed for who she was, but for what she represented, a game piece, quite literally. Her life, her history, her hopes and fears, all rendered irrelevant by a mind that views human beings as mere components in an elaborate puzzle. This is not murder for gain or revenge or passion. This is murder as intellectual exercise, as demonstration of capability. Then what do they want? I demanded, rising from my chair. Why involve you at all? Why not simply commit their crimes in silence? Holmes ceased his pacing, turning to face me with an expression I had rarely seen upon his ascetic features, something approaching genuine uncertainty. That, Watson, is the question that troubles me most profoundly. Publicity, no. For they have taken pains to ensure the first death appeared as suicide. Recognition, it's possible, but they could achieve that more directly. Proof of superiority. Warmer, perhaps, but still incomplete. No, I believe there is something more at work here, something I have not yet grasped. The chess metaphor is in chess. The game's pleasure derives not merely from victory, but from the elegance of the combination, the aesthetic beauty of the strategy. Our killer is not simply playing to win. They are playing to demonstrate mastery. The afternoon post brought a development that transformed Holmes's brooding frustration into focused intensity. Among the usual correspondence, a letter from a manufacturer in Manchester requesting assistance with industrial espionage, an inquiry from a member of Parliament. Regarding a delicate family matter, there appeared a cream-colored envelope bearing no return address. The handwriting was immediately recognizable. Those same deliberately disguised capitals. That same tremor in the vertical strokes. Holmes opened it with his gloved hands. KD4. The board is set. Below this cryptic message was a postscript written in smaller letters. She died believing herself alone. That is the true tragedy, is it not? That one might perish, surrounded by millions, yet utterly isolated. London is filled with such souls, Mr. Holmes. I am doing them a kindness. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. Chess notation, I observed. King 2d4. But what does it signify? Holmes had already moved to his bookshelf, extracting a volume on chess strategy and spreading it open upon the cluttered table. KD4 is an unusual opening move, illegal in fact, as the king cannot move to the center of the board initially. Unless he paused, his expression sharpening. Unless we are not at the beginning of the game. Unless moves have already been made that we did not observe. Watson, fetch me a map of London, the largest scale we possess. As I complied, pulling the detailed street map from our reference collection, Holmes began placing small objects upon its coins, buttons, whatever came to hand. Clockenwell, he murmured, positioning a button at the location of Helena Marbury's lodgings. That is where the White King was taken. His fingers moved with increasing speed, measuring distances, calculating. I watched, fascinated, despite my horror, as a pattern began to emerge. Holmes had positioned 8 coins in a rough grid pattern across central London. He breathed, stepping back to survey his work. If I am correct, and pray God I am not, then our killer has already selected their hunting grounds. 3 moves to checkmate, they said. Helena Marbury was the first. The second victim will be taken from either here, he indicated Bloomsbury, or here in Southwark. And the final move, the checkmate itself, will occur in Westminster, or perhaps Mayfair. Areas of significance, Watson. places where death carries symbolic weight. But Holmes, that's speculation. How can you possibly? Because he interrupted, his gray eyes burning with intensity. A true chess master never makes a random move. Everything serves the larger strategy. Our killer is telling me exactly what they intend to do. The question is whether I possess sufficient intelligence to understand the message before another innocent perishes. The evening brought with it. Cab passed like a ghost ship through mist. Holmes had sent urgent telegrams to Scotland Yard requesting increased patrols in Bloomsbury and Southwark. Though he had refused to explain his reasoning to the bewildered constables who arrived to receive their instructions, Lestrade, to his credit, had trusted Holmes's judgment sufficiently to deploy men without demanding justification. Though I suspected the inspector's faith would not withstand much strain without results. I had retired briefly to my room to pen a letter to my wife, assuring her that I would remain at Baker Street for the duration of this peculiar case. Upon my return to our sitting room, I found Holmes had transformed the space into something resembling a military command post. The map of London dominated the central table, now marked with red and black pins, indicating locations of interest. Beside it lay dozens of newspaper clippings, which he had evidently retrieved from his extensive archives while I was occupied elsewhere. "I have been researching our victim," Holmes announced without preamble, gesturing toward a small pile of documents. "Helena Marbury, or rather the woman who called herself Helena Marbury. For I am increasingly convinced that name was as much a fiction as her supposed widowhood. 3 years ago, a woman matching her description appeared in Clerkenwell and took lodgings under that name. Before that, nothing. No birth records, no marriage certificate, no presence whatsoever in any official documentation I can access. She existed, Watson, but only partially, only superficially. I examined the papers he had assembled, finding them frustratingly sparse. A rent receipt, a brief mention in a parish newsletter regarding charitable donations, a milliner's bill, the fragments of an invisible life. Perhaps she was hiding from someone, an abusive husband, creditors, scandal of some nature. Precisely my thought, Holmes agreed, returning to his contemplation of the map. She had constructed an identity designed to avoid scrutiny, to exist beneath notice. Yet somehow, our killer found her, selected her, that suggests either remarkable investigative ability or prior knowledge. Did they choose her because of her anonymity, or despite it? Was her isolation the point, or merely convenient? A knock at the door interrupted his speculation. Mrs. Hudson appeared with a visiting card upon her tray, her expression disapproving. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes. He insists it cannot wait." Though I told him the hour was inappropriate for social calls, Holmes took the card and examined it with raised eyebrows. "Professor Edmund Ashford, University College London, Department of Mathematics." "Show him up immediately, Mrs. Hudson. This may prove illuminating." The man who entered our sitting room moments later was perhaps 50 years of age, tall and spare, with the stooped shoulders and ink-stained fingers characteristic of the academic profession. His eyes, however, possessed an alertness that belied his otherwise abstracted appearance. He clutched a leather portfolio to his chest as though it contained items of incalculable value. "Mr. Holmes." "Dr. Watson, forgive the intrusion," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of the lecture hall. "I have come on a matter that may seem trivial, yet it has disturbed me profoundly. 3 days ago, I received an unusual communication, a mathematical puzzle, delivered anonymously to my office at the university. Normally I would dismiss such things as student pranks, but the sophistication of the problem troubled me. Then, this afternoon, I read of the unfortunate death in Clerkenwell, and certain details mentioned in the evening papers caused me to reconsider everything." Holmes gestured toward a chair, his entire demeanor transformed into one of intense focus. You interest me greatly, Professor. Please, describe this puzzle in detail. Ashford opened his portfolio with trembling fingers, extracting a sheet of paper covered in complex mathematical notation. It is an optimization problem, essentially. Given certain constraints and variables, one must determine the most efficient sequence of moves to achieve a desired outcome. The constraints involve geographic coordinates within London, temporal windows of opportunity, and probability calculations regarding human behavior patterns. I solved it as an intellectual exercise, Mr. Holmes. Never imagining his voice broke slightly, never imagining it might represent an actual plan for criminal activity. I leaned forward to examine the paper, though the symbols might as well have been hieroglyphics for all I could comprehend them. Holmes, however, studied the equations with evident understanding, his finger tracing certain elements while his lips compressed into a thin line. This coordinate here, Holmes indicated a particular notation corresponds to Clockenwell, does it not? Yes, Ashford whispered. And these others mapped them this afternoon correspond to locations in Bloomsbury, Southwark, and Westminster. Mr. Holmes, I believe I was sent the mathematical framework for a series of murders. The puzzle asked me to optimize the sequence, to determine which order would minimize risk of detection while maximizing symbolic impact. I solved it. God help me. I provided the answer to a question I should never have entertained. Holmes stood abruptly, moving to his desk where he withdrew the card that had arrived with the afternoon post. Professor, is this the handwriting in which your puzzle was delivered? Ashford examined the card and nodded miserably. Identical. I am complicit, am I not? My intellectual vanity has made me accessory to murder. You are a victim, Professor. Nothing more, Holmes replied firmly. Our adversary is collecting collaborators, building their grand design through manipulation of others. They sent you the puzzle knowing you would solve it, that your professional pride would compel you to engage with the problem. You were never meant to realize its true purpose until too late. Just as Miss Marbury was never meant to understand why she was chosen. Can you stop them? Ashford asked, desperately. The solution I provided suggests to more optimal targets and timing windows within the next 48 hours. Holmes's expression grew grim. That, Professor, is precisely what they expect me to attempt. And therein lies the trap. Professor Ashford remained in our sitting room for another hour, during which Holmes subjected him to a methodical interrogation that would have done credit to a prosecuting barrister. Every detail of the puzzle's delivery was examined. The quality of the paper, the time of arrival, the manner in which it had been left upon his desk at the university. The professor recalled finding it after returning from a lecture on probability theory, simply lying atop his other correspondence as though it had materialized from thin air. The porter at the college gate remembered no unusual visitors that morning, and the cleaning staff had noticed nothing out of the ordinary when at last Ashford departed, extracting from Holmes a promise that his unwitting contribution would remain confidential. I found my friend standing once more before his improvised map, staring at it with an expression of profound frustration. The evening had worn on toward midnight, and the fog showed no signs of lifting. Beyond our windows, London had become a city of shadows and uncertainty. They are playing on multiple boards simultaneously, Holmes said quietly, more to himself than to me. The physical board, where actual murders occur. The intellectual board, where puzzles and clues are deployed to guide my investigation. And a third board, Watson, one I am only beginning to perceive, the psychological board, where my own responses become part of their design. Every move I make is anticipated, perhaps even desired. I am not investigating this case so much as performing in it. I poured 2 glasses of brandy, pressing one into his hand, despite his evident reluctance to be interrupted. Then what do you propose? We cannot simply do nothing while 2 more victims fall into this monster's trap, can we not? Holmes replied bitterly, though he accepted the brandy and drank deeply. Consider the logic, Watson. Ashford's puzzle provided optimal locations and timing, based on certain assumptions about police response patterns and investigative procedures. But those assumptions necessarily include my own behavior. The solution, he calculated factors in how Sherlock Holmes would react to the first murder, where I would deploy resources, which leads I would pursue. If I act according to pattern, I serve their purpose. If I deviate, I venture into unknown territory where my usual advantages may not apply. Surely that is overthinking matters, I protested. You are giving this killer too much credit. No one, however clever, can predict another person's actions with mathematical certainty. Holmes turned from the map, his gaunt features drawn with exhaustion. You are correct, of course. Human behavior is not truly deterministic. Yet our adversary need not predict with absolute certainty, only with sufficient probability to maintain strategic advantage. Consider, I am known throughout London as a consulting detective of specific methods and habits. My monographs have been published, my cases chronicled in your narratives, my techniques discussed in criminological circles. I am, in a sense, a known quantity. My responses to certain stimuli can be reasonably anticipated by anyone who has studied my work with sufficient attention. The implications of this statement troubled me greatly. Then you believe this killer has been studying you, preparing specifically to engage with you. I believe it is the only hypothesis that adequately explains the facts. The chess metaphor, the mathematical puzzle. The symbolic elements all suggest someone who thinks in patterns and probabilities, someone trained in logical analysis. Perhaps an academic, like Ashford, but with a moral compass shattered by some trauma or philosophical conviction. Perhaps a criminal mastermind of unusual education. In either case, we face an opponent who has chosen the battlefield with care. A sharp knock at the street door below interrupted our conversation. Moments later, Mrs. Hudson appeared with evident alarm, announcing that Inspector Lestrade had returned, bearing urgent news. The inspector entered in a state of considerable agitation. His coat soaked through with fog moisture, and his breathing labored. Mr. Holmes. There has been another communication, he gasped, pulling a damp envelope from his coat. It was delivered to Scotland Yard not 20 minutes ago, left at the front desk while the duty sergeant was occupied with a drunk. The messenger, if there was one, vanished before anyone could obtain a description. The envelope is addressed to you, sir. Care of the Yard. Holmes accepted the envelope with his customary caution, examining it thoroughly before breaking the seal. Inside was another card bearing that now familiar, disguised handwriting. Though the message this time was longer and more elaborate in its mockery, you have done well, Mr. Holmes. The professor's visit was enlightening, was it not? You begin to understand the depth of the game. But understanding is not prevention, and knowledge without action is merely refined helplessness. The second move approaches. Will you interpose yourself between the blade and the throat? Or will you hesitate, fearful that your intervention serves my purpose? Paralysis and panic both accomplish my ends. Choose wisely, detective. The clock measures more than hours. Below this text was written a time 2:47 a.m. and a single word, Bloomsbury. I checked my pocket watch and felt my blood chill. It was currently 12:30. We had just over 2 hours before whatever horror awaited would unfold. Lestrade had already begun issuing orders to constables in the street below, his voice carrying up through the open door. Holmes, however, remained motionless, the card held between his gloved fingers, his expression unreadable. Holmes, I urged, we must act immediately. 2 hours is hardly sufficient to organize a proper response. To evacuate potential victims, to establish surveillance, and that, Holmes interrupted softly, is precisely what our killer desires. They provide just enough time to create panic, just enough specificity to focus our attention, just enough uncertainty to ensure chaos. Watson, we are being herded like sheep toward the slaughter. Despite his misgivings, Holmes could not permit inaction in the face of an explicit threat. Within 15 minutes, we had assembled in a four-wheeler racing through the fog-shrouded streets toward Bloomsbury, accompanied by Lestrade and 4 constables in a separate conveyance. Holmes had brought his revolver, which I noted with some relief, though his expression remained troubled as we jostled through the darkness. The city at this hour possessed an eerie quality, the gas lamps creating isolated pools of sickly yellow light that seemed only to emphasize the oppressive gloom between them. "If we assume the chess notation system holds," Holmes said, raising his voice above the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, "then the Bloomsbury strike would correspond to square E5 or F6 on our theoretical board. That encompasses roughly a dozen streets, perhaps 200 buildings. Even with every constable the yard can muster, we cannot possibly monitor every potential victim within the time remaining." Lestrade leaned forward, his features grim in the dim interior light. "Then what do you suggest, Mr. Holmes?" "We cannot simply abandon the district to its fate. No, but we can think strategically rather than frantically. Our killer has demonstrated a preference for isolated victims, individuals who will not be immediately missed. Helena Marbury lived alone in a rented room above a shop. If the pattern holds, the second victim will be similarly situated a boarding house, perhaps, or private lodgings in a building with multiple tenants. Someone whose absence might go unnoticed until morning, whose screams, if any, would be muffled by walls and distance." I found myself gripping my walking stick more tightly, the weight of my revolver solid against my hip. "That still leaves dozens of possibilities, Holmes. How do we narrow the field further?" "By considering what we know of the killer's methodology. They favor symbolism, theatrical gestures. The chess pieces, the mathematical puzzle, taunting messages all suggest someone who views murder not merely as an act but as a statement. Therefore, the location itself must carry meaning. Not simply any Bloomsbury address, but one that resonates, that adds layers of significance to their grand design." The cab lurched around a corner, and through the window I glimpsed the imposing facade of the British Museum, its columns ghostly in the fog. Holmes sat forward suddenly, his eyes widening with recognition. "Of course. The British Museum. Lestrade, are there residential buildings in the immediate vicinity of the museum? Old houses converted to lodgings, perhaps formerly occupied by the gentry, but now fallen into more modest use?" "Russell Square," Lestrade replied immediately, "and the streets radiating from it. Several large houses have been subdivided into flats and rooms, quite respectable, mostly clerks and minor civil servants, a few students from the university." "Students," Holmes repeated, his voice sharp with certainty. "Watson Ashford mentioned that his puzzle was delivered to his office at University College London. The killer has already demonstrated an interest in academic settings. What if the connection runs deeper? What if the second victim, like the professor, is somehow associated with the university?" We descended from the cab in Russell Square, where Lestrade had arranged for his constables to assemble. The square itself was deserted, the private garden at its center locked behind iron railings. Around its perimeter stood substantial houses, their windows dark, their occupants presumably asleep. Holmes immediately began directing the constables to strategic positions, instructing them to watch for any unusual activity while remaining as inconspicuous as possible. "The killer knows we are here," Holmes murmured to me as we surveyed the square. "They anticipated our arrival, probably calculated it with the same mathematical precision they applied to Ashford's puzzle. We are not preventing their crime, Watson. We are witnessing it. The question is whether they intend for us to succeed or fail in our intervention." The nearby church bell tolled 2 o'clock, its sound muffled and distant through the fog. 47 minutes remained until the specified time. Holmes had begun a methodical circuit of the square, examining door numbers and occasionally consulting a small notebook he had extracted from his coat. I accompanied him, my senses heightened by the oppressive atmosphere and the ticking urgency of our situation. "There," Holmes said abruptly, halting before a house on the square's eastern side. Number 17. For stories subdivided into individual rooms. The ground floor windows show recent repair. See the newer putty around the panes. Someone has been making improvements, suggesting a landlord who maintains the property adequately. Respectable, but not expensive. Exactly the sort of establishment where a student or young professional might lodge. Holmes, there must be a dozen people residing within. How can we possibly? He raised a hand for silence, his head tilted in an attitude of intense listening. For a moment, I heard nothing but the distant murmur of the city and the soft tread of constables on their patrol. Then, faintly, from somewhere within the house before us, came a sound that froze my blood. A woman's scream, suddenly cut short, followed by the unmistakable crash of breaking furniture. Holmes was moving before the sound fully registered, his shoulder striking the front door with surprising force. The lock, mercifully old and weakened by time, gave way after the second impact. We plunged into darkness, Holmes calling for the constables even as we stumbled up a narrow staircase toward the upper floors. Another sound reached us: footsteps, rapid and descending from somewhere above. Someone was fleeing through the house, and we were racing to intercept them before another innocent life was stolen by this calculating predator, who had turned murder into mathematics. The staircase was narrow and treacherous, its steps worn smooth by decades of use. Holmes ascended with reckless speed, his lean form disappearing into the gloom above, while I followed as quickly as my old wound permitted. Behind us, I could hear Lestrade shouting orders and the heavy tread of constables entering the building. The house had awakened to our invasion, doors opening on various landings, confused voices calling out questions into the darkness. We reached the third-floor landing to find a door standing open, pale lamplight spilling across the threadbare carpet. Holmes paused at the threshold, and I saw his hand move to his revolver before he entered. I drew my own weapon and followed, unprepared for the scene that confronted us within. The room was small and modestly furnished, clearly the lodging of someone of limited means. A narrow bed stood against one wall, its coverings disturbed but not violently so. A writing desk occupied the space beneath the window, papers scattered across its surface. And seated in a chair beside the desk, her face pale but composed, was a young woman of perhaps 25 years, dressed in a nightgown with a shawl pulled hastily around her shoulders. "He left," she said, her voice remarkably steady, given the circumstances. "30 seconds before you arrived, perhaps less. Through that window," she gestured toward the casement, which stood open to admit the fog and cold night air. He was quite apologetic about it, actually. Said he regretted the necessity, but that the performance must continue. Holmes crossed to the window in 3 strides, leaning out to examine the exterior. I could see his frustration in the rigid set of his shoulders. A drain pipe provides access to the roof, and from there, a dozen routes of escape across the neighboring buildings. He planned his exit as carefully as his entrance. "Madam, you are Miss Caroline Fletcher," the woman replied. "I am a research assistant at University College, working with Professor Ashford on statistical analysis. I assume that is why I was selected, though the gentleman who visited me tonight was rather cryptic on that point." Lestrade had arrived. Breathing heavily from his rapid ascent, his face flushed with exertion. "Miss Fletcher, are you harmed? Did this man assault you?" "He did not," she answered, and I observed that her hands, though clasped tightly in her lap, did not tremble. "He entered through the window approximately 10 minutes ago. I awakened to find him standing beside my bed, holding a cloth saturated with chloroform. However, he made no attempt to use it. Instead, he apologized for the intrusion, placed this upon my desk, and then simply waited. When we heard you breaking through the front door, He expressed satisfaction that events were proceeding according to schedule, and departed through the window. Upon the desk lay another card, identical in style to those we had received previously. Holmes examined it without touching, reading aloud. "The second move is interrupted, but not prevented. You arrive precisely on time, Mr. Holmes, demonstrating that you dance to the rhythm I establish. Miss Fletcher serves as evidence of my restraint could have taken her, but chose demonstration over execution. The third move will offer no such mercy." Checkmate approaches. I helped Miss Fletcher to her feet, noting that despite her outward composure, her legs were unsteady. "You are certain he did you no harm? Perhaps we should summon a physician." "I am quite well, Dr. Watson," she assured me, and I realized she had recognized both Holmes and myself. Frightened, certainly, but unharmed. He was almost gentlemanly in his conduct, bizarre as that sounds. He spoke to me as one might address an acquaintance, explaining that I had been selected to prove a point about predictability and control. He said that Mr. Holmes would arrive at precisely 2:43 a.m., and when I glanced at my mantel clock as you entered, I saw it was exactly that time. Holmes had moved to examine the papers on the desk, his eyes scanning their contents rapidly. Statistical analyses, probability distributions, game theory applications. "You work with Ashford on optimization problems, Miss Fletcher?" "I do. I've been assisting him with a particularly complex puzzle that arrived earlier this week. We found it intellectually stimulating, though her voice faltered slightly, though we had no idea it represented anything beyond theoretical exercise." "You are not culpable," Holmes said firmly, though his attention remained fixed on the documents. "You are merely another instrument in a larger composition. Tell me, did this man give any indication of his identity? Any detail, however small, that might aid our investigation?" Miss Fletcher considered carefully, her scholarly training evident in her methodical approach to recollection. "He was tall, perhaps 6 feet, slender build. He wore dark clothing and gloves. I could see no skin save his face, which was partially obscured by a scarf. His voice was educated, no particular regional accent that I could detect. And his eyes, Dr. Watson, they were the most unsettling aspect. He looked at me not with malice, but with curiosity, as though I were a specimen under glass, something to be studied rather than feared." "Age?" Holmes prompted. "Difficult to determine with certainty. 40, perhaps, though he moved with the agility of a younger man. And there was something else, something odd. When he spoke, he occasionally touched his left temple as though experiencing pain or discomfort. A habitual gesture, I would say, performed unconsciously." Holmes straightened abruptly, his expression transforming into one of intense concentration. "A neurological tic, possibly. Watson, that suggests a medical condition," I completed. "Chronic headaches, perhaps, or the aftermath of head trauma. Something that causes persistent discomfort." "Precisely." Holmes turned back to Miss Fletcher. "You have been extraordinarily helpful and remarkably brave. Lestrade, I suggest Miss Fletcher be placed under police protection until this matter is resolved. Our killer has demonstrated restraint tonight, but I do not trust that mercy to extend beyond its immediate purpose." The inspector nodded his agreement, already issuing instructions to the constables who had crowded into the small room. As arrangements were made for Miss Fletcher's safety, Holmes drew me aside, his voice low and urgent. "Watson, we have learned something valuable tonight, though not what our adversary intended. They made a mistake, small one, but significant. They revealed themselves physically, allowed a witness to observe them directly. That suggests either growing confidence or increasing desperation. In either case, the endgame approaches more rapidly than anticipated. We returned to Baker Street as dawn was breaking over London, the fog finally beginning to lift under the weak rays of the rising sun. Holmes remained silent throughout the journey. his angular profile etched against the cab window, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in that attitude of profound contemplation I had learned never to interrupt, only when we had regained the sanctuary of our sitting room. And Mrs. Hudson had provided strong coffee and toast, which neither of us touched. Did he finally speak? "I have been guilty of intellectual vanity, Watson," he said quietly, settling into his chair with the weariness of a man who had not slept in 36 hours. I allowed myself to become fixated on the complexity of the puzzle, the elegance of the mathematical framework, the symbolic resonance of the chess metaphor. In doing so, I nearly overlooked the most fundamental question: why has this killer revealed themselves at all? Why not simply commit their murders in silence and obscurity, as countless others do? I sipped my coffee, grateful for its warmth, if not its taste. You suggested earlier that they seek recognition, proof of superiority. That was my initial hypothesis, yes. But Miss Fletcher's testimony has forced me to reconsider. Consider her description: a man who apologizes for his intrusion, who speaks as though to an acquaintance, who demonstrates restraint despite having ample opportunity to kill. This is not the behavior of a remorseless monster reveling in cruelty. This is someone performing a role, following a script they have written for themselves. The question is whether they believe in that script or are compelled by it. I confess I do not follow your reasoning. Holmes rose and began that restless pacing that indicated his mind was racing ahead of his ability to articulate his thoughts. Suppose our killer is not primarily motivated by bloodlust, or even by the desire to demonstrate intellectual superiority. Suppose instead that they are attempting to prove something to themselves, to validate some internal theory or philosophy through practical demonstration. The murders are not the goal, but rather the evidence, the data points in an experiment. Miss Fletcher was spared not from mercy, but because her death was unnecessary to the proof being constructed. But proof of what? I demanded, frustration creeping into my voice. What theorem requires human sacrifice for its validation? That is indeed the question. Holmes stopped before his chemistry table, absently rearranging beakers and retorts. Throughout history, Watson, there have been individuals who convinced themselves that conventional morality did not apply to superior intellects, that the pursuit of knowledge or truth justified any action, however abhorrent. From the ancient philosophers who defended slavery as natural law to the modern theorists who propose social Darwinism, the pattern repeats. I suspect our killer belongs to this tradition. Someone who has reasoned themselves into a position where murder becomes merely a logical step in demonstrating some grand principle. The morning light, streaming through our windows, seemed to bring little comfort, merely exchanging one form of obscurity for another. I thought of Helena Marbury, dead in her lonely room, and of Miss Fletcher, who had faced her potential murderer with extraordinary courage. Two women, both connected to academic pursuits, both selected for reasons that transcended personal animosity. The third victim, I said. Westminster or Mayfair, you suggested. Someone of higher social standing, perhaps to complete whatever pattern is being established. Almost certainly. The progression has been deliberate, from Clerkenwell, a district of workers and tradesmen, to Bloomsbury, the territory of students and intellectuals, to Westminster or Mayfair, the realm of power and privilege. Our killer is ascending a social hierarchy, though whether to demonstrate that all classes are equally vulnerable or that they possess the capability to strike anywhere remains unclear. A knock at the door interrupted us. Mrs. Hudson appeared with the morning papers, her expression troubled. Mr. Holmes, the news vendors are already crying about last night's events. The evening editions yesterday reported the Clerkenwell death as a tragic suicide. But now with the incident in Russell Square, speculation is running wild. Holmes accepted the papers and scanned them rapidly, his lips compressing into a thin line. Sensationalism and inaccuracy in equal measure, as expected. Though here, buried in the Times, is something more substantial. Watson, do you recall mention of a medical researcher named Dr. Marcus Ashton? The name is familiar. Neurology, I believe. Made some controversial proposals regarding criminal psychology. Indeed. He published a monograph 3 years ago arguing that certain criminal behaviors could be predicted and potentially prevented through mathematical modeling of social conditions. The work was dismissed by most of the medical establishment as reductive and ethically dubious. But look here at the Times reports that Dr. Ashton has been missing from his Westminster residence for the past 4 days. His housekeeper filed a report with the police yesterday, stating that he left no indication of his destination and missed several important appointments. I felt a chill pass through me despite the warmth of the fire. You believe Ashton is the third victim? Or, Holmes said slowly, his gray eyes meeting mine with an intensity that was almost physical, he is the perpetrator. Consider, a medical background would explain the precise knowledge of anatomy and pharmacology demonstrated in Helena Marbury's murder. Expertise in mathematical modeling would account for the optimization puzzle sent to Professor Ashford. A residence in Westminster places him precisely where we predicted the final move would occur. And most tellingly, Watson, a specialist in neurology who proposed controversial theories about criminal behavior might well suffer from the chronic neurological condition Miss Fletcher observed the habitual touching of the left temple. Good God, Holmes. If you are correct, then we are dealing not with a common murderer, but with a physician. Someone bound by oath to preserve life. A physician who has convinced himself that his actions serve a higher purpose, Holmes corrected grimly, who views murder as experimental methodology rather than moral transgression. We must locate Dr. Ashton immediately, whether as potential victim or confirmed suspect. Lestrade must be informed at once, and we require access to Ashton's residence and medical records. The endgame approaches, Watson, and I fear the checkmate will be more devastating than any of us have anticipated. By mid-morning, we had assembled at Dr. Marcus Ashton's Westminster residence, a handsome 4-story townhouse on a quiet street near St. James's Park. Lestrade had secured the necessary warrants with admirable efficiency, though his face betrayed considerable skepticism regarding Holmes's theory. The housekeeper, a severe woman of middle years named Mrs. Pemberton, admitted us with evident reluctance, her lips pursed in disapproval at this invasion of her employer's privacy. Dr. Ashton is a gentleman of impeccable character, she insisted as we entered the marble-floored entrance hall. Whatever you suspect him of, you are mistaken. He is devoted to his research, to the betterment of society through scientific understanding. The very notion that he might be involved in criminal activity is preposterous. Holmes listened politely to her protestations while his eyes catalogued every detail of our surroundings. The house was furnished with understated elegance, the walls lined with bookshelves containing medical texts and mathematical treatises. A faint smell of carbolic acid hung in the air, the residue of a physician's professional habits. We proceeded upstairs to Ashton's private study, a spacious room overlooking the street, where the true nature of the doctor's preoccupations became immediately apparent. One entire wall had been converted into what could only be described as a monument to obsession. Photographs, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes covered every inch of surface, all connected by lengths of colored string forming an intricate web of associations. At the center of this bizarre display was a large photograph of Sherlock Holmes himself, torn from some publication and pinned with almost reverential care. "Good Lord," Lestrade breathed, approaching the wall with horrified fascination. "He has been studying you, Mr. Holmes, every case, every published account, even transcripts of your testimony in various trials. This must represent years of accumulated research." Holmes examined the display with remarkable composure. though I noticed his jaw tighten as he traced the connections Ashton had drawn between disparate cases. Not merely studying, Inspector. Analyzing, categorizing, attempting to reduce my methods to predictable algorithms. See here, he has created probability matrices for various types of crimes, calculating the likelihood of specific investigative approaches based on past behaviors. And here, Watson, your own narratives have been dissected paragraph by paragraph, with annotations regarding accuracy and potential insights into my reasoning processes. I felt a strange violation examining my own words thus analyzed, transformed from literary efforts into clinical data. This is the work of a deeply disturbed mind, or an exceptionally disciplined one, Holmes countered, moving to Ashton's desk where papers lay scattered in apparent disorder. There is method here, Watson, rigorous and systematic. Ashton has attempted to create a comprehensive theory of criminal investigation, treating it as a science subject to mathematical laws. In doing so, he has convinced himself that he can predict and control outcomes with near certainty. The murders are not crimes to him, but demonstrations, proofs of his theoretical framework. Among the papers, Holmes discovered a leather-bound journal filled with dense handwriting. He paged through it rapidly, his expression growing increasingly grave. Listen to this entry, dated 6 months ago. The limitations of theoretical work become increasingly apparent. Without empirical validation, my models remain mere speculation, subject to dismissal by those lacking vision to perceive their significance. Application is necessary. The Detective Holmes represents the pinnacle of investigative reasoning within current methodological constraints. If I can demonstrate predictive control over his responses, the validity of my framework becomes irrefutable. The ethical considerations, while regrettable, are outweighed by the transformative potential of proven social mathematics. Lestrade had gone pale. He is using murder to prove an academic theory. That is madness. It is logic divorced from morality, Holmes corrected. Ashton has reasoned himself into a position where human life becomes merely a variable in his equations, its value subordinate to the pursuit of intellectual validation. The progression of victims from the invisible Helena Marbury to the academic Caroline Fletcher, to whomever he intends for his final demonstration, each serves to test different aspects of his predictive model. I had been examining other materials on the desk and discovered something that made my blood run cold. Holmes, look at this. It is a detailed floor plan of 2-1 B Baker Street, including notes on sightlines, entry points, and what appears to be a schedule of our daily routines. Holmes took the document from my hands, studying it with an intensity that bordered on fury. The checkmate is not another random victim, Watson. It is us. Ashton intends to conclude his grand demonstration by proving he can penetrate our own defenses, that he can strike at the very heart of the investigative apparatus that has been attempting to stop him. We are not merely investigating this case. We have become its final target. Mrs. Pemberton had been listening from the doorway, her severe expression crumbling into distress. But where is he? If Dr. Ashton has truly done these terrible things, where has he gone? Holmes turned to face her directly. That is the question upon which everything now depends. When did you last see your employer, Mrs. Pemberton? What were his final words to you? The housekeeper clutched at her apron, tears beginning to stream down her weathered face. 4 days ago, in the evening. He seemed agitated, excited. He said he was embarking on the most important work of his career, that within a week the scientific community would be forced to acknowledge his genius. He took a traveling case and departed in a hansom cab. I assumed he had gone to a conference or research engagement. He often traveled for his work. Did he indicate his destination? No, but I heard him instruct the cab driver. He said, "Take me to the Strand, near the Savoy." I thought nothing of it at the time. Holmes and I exchanged glances. The Strand, with its hotels and theaters, its proximity to both Westminster and the city, provided a perfect base of operations for someone wishing to move freely throughout central London. Ashton could be anywhere within a mile radius, watching and waiting for the optimal moment to make his final move. Lestrade Holmes said urgently, "I need every available man searching hotels and boarding houses between the Strand and Covent Garden. Ashton will be registered under an assumed name, but he is distinctive in appearance, tall, slender, approximately 40 years of age, and he will have been inquiring about chemical supplies or medical equipment." The search proceeded with methodical urgency throughout the afternoon, constables fanning out across the Strand district while Holmes, Lestrade, and I coordinated efforts from Scotland Yard. Reports filtered back with frustrating regularity. Dozens of tall, slender men in their 40s had taken rooms in the area during the past week, but none matched Ashton's description with sufficient certainty to warrant immediate action. Holmes grew increasingly agitated as the hours passed, pacing the confines of Lestrade's office like a caged predator, pausing occasionally to consult his watch with visible irritation. "He has gone to ground," Holmes muttered, more to himself than to us. He anticipated our discovery of his residence, perhaps even desired it as part of his demonstration. Every move we make has been calculated in advance, factored into his wretched equations. We are not hunters pursuing prey, Watson. We are laboratory rats navigating a maze, and Ashton observes from above, recording our every turn. I attempted to offer reassurance, though I felt little myself. We have disrupted his timeline at least. Miss Fletcher survived when he intended another death. That must have introduced uncertainty into his calculations. Did it? Holmes turned on me with surprising intensity. Or did her survival serve his purposes equally well? He demonstrated restraint, proved he could have killed, but chose otherwise. Perhaps that was always the intended outcome. And my arrival at precisely 2:43 a.m. was not an interruption, but a confirmation. Every action, every reaction, all proceeding according to his design. Lestrade cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Mr. Holmes, we are doing everything possible. Every hotel, every boarding house, every private lodging is being systematically searched. If Ashton is in this Strand district, we shall find him. And if he is not?" Holmes replied sharply. If my reasoning about the Strand was itself a predictable deduction, anticipated and countered. "No, Inspector, we must think beyond the obvious. Ashton is a physician, a man of science. He would require privacy for his preparations, access to medical and chemical supplies, a location from which he could observe without being observed. A hotel room would not suffice for such purposes. I considered this problem from a different angle. Holmes, you mentioned Ashton suffered from chronic headaches or neurological discomfort. Such a condition would require ongoing treatment. Might he have visited a pharmacy or medical supplier recently?" Holmes stopped his pacing abruptly, his expression transforming. "Watson, you have touched upon something significant. A man of Ashton's condition would indeed require regular access to medications, analgesics, perhaps laudanum or morphine for severe episodes. And a physician would not trust ordinary chemists with his prescriptions. He would seek out establishments that cater to medical professionals, places where his requests would raise no questions. Within 15 minutes, Holmes had compiled a list of 3 pharmaceutical suppliers in central London, known for their discretion and their willingness to accommodate unusual requests from members of the medical profession. We departed Scotland Yard immediately, taking a fast cab to the first establishment, a shop near Charing Cross operated by a wizened chemist named Gribbins, who regarded our questions with professional caution. "I serve many physicians, gentlemen," he said carefully. "Patient confidentiality extends to the doctors themselves when they seek treatment." "I cannot simply divulge," Holmes interrupted with uncharacteristic bluntness, placing a sovereign on the counter. This is not a medical inquiry, but a criminal investigation of the gravest nature. Lives are at stake. Mr. Gribbins, has a Dr. Marcus Ashton purchased medications from you within the past week? The chemist's resistance crumbled under Holmes's intensity and the gleam of gold. There was a gentleman, 4 days ago. Gave the name Ashton, yes. Purchased a significant quantity of chloroform, carbolic acid, and morphine sulfate. Said he was conducting research that required these substances. I thought it unusual, but not unprecedented. He paid cash and seemed most anxious to avoid delay. Did he indicate where he was staying? No, but he arrived on foot, coming from the direction of the river. And when he left, I happened to observe professional curiosity. You understand that he walked toward Villiers Street, heading down toward the embankment. Holmes's eyes blazed with sudden comprehension. The railway arches. Watson Lestrade. There are storage facilities and small workshops beneath the Charing Cross railway arches. Spaces rented by tradesmen and merchants. A physician requiring privacy and space for preparation would find such a location ideally slated. Anonymous, accessible, yet hidden in plain sight. We hastened toward the embankment, where the massive brick arches supporting the railway lines created a warren of darkened spaces. Some legitimately rented, others abandoned, or used for purposes their owners preferred not to examine too closely. The sound of trains rumbling overhead provided constant percussion to our search, making communication difficult and heightening the oppressive atmosphere. Holmes moved with predatory certainty now, examining locks and doorways with his lens, occasionally pausing to test a door or peer through grimy windows. Here, he announced finally, indicating a wooden door set deep within one of the arches. The lock has been recently oiled -C, the fresh residue. And there, Watson, barely visible in the dust, the impression of medical boot heels, distinctive in their pattern. Ashton has been here, perhaps remains within even now. Lestrade signaled to the constables who had accompanied us, drawing his truncheon while I readied my revolver. Holmes, ignoring all caution, applied his shoulder to the door, which gave way with a splintering crash. We plunged into darkness. The air thick with chemical odors and something else, the unmistakable scent of recent habitation. Holmes struck a match, revealing a space that confirmed our worst fears. A makeshift laboratory occupied one corner, complete with beakers and burners and rows of chemical bottles. Against the far wall stood a cot and writing desk, papers scattered across its surface. And pinned to the brick wall above the desk was a large map of Baker Street, with 2-1B marked in red ink and annotated with times, dates, and cryptic symbols whose meaning I could only guess at with dread. But of Dr. Marcus Ashton himself there was no sign. The laboratory was abandoned, the cot made with military precision, the chemical apparatus arranged as though awaiting a return that would never come. Holmes examined everything with feverish intensity, finally discovering a note weighted down by a chess piece, the White King, twin to those found with the previous victims. Holmes read aloud, his voice hollow. Checkmate arrives at midnight. Mr. Holmes, all variables have been accounted for, all contingencies calculated. You have performed admirably, precisely as predicted. The final proof awaits at the beginning, where all games commence. Until then, I remain your devoted student and ultimate examiner. I checked my watch. It was 7:30 in the evening. 4.5 hours remained until midnight, and somewhere in London. Dr. Marcus Ashton prepared to conclude his murderous demonstration with ourselves as the final victims.